Jerry and Chess Network did a video on this Benko game, and that can be found right here. All right, so Benko playing black against Bobby. We have e4. G6 is Robach's defense, named for Karl Robach of Austria, a top leading player. It was either 1960 or 1962 Olympiad that Karl Robach took the gold medal on the first board. All right, d4, bishop g7, knight c3 is a standard line. d6, f4 is the pseudo-Austrian attack, but then knight to f6 transposes to an actual Austrian attack, which is a subvariation of the Pirz, which Rotkopf would tell us if Rotkopf was here. All right, so we have the Austrian attack in Pirz's defense that we've transposed to, which is signified by f4 when this knight is already here. Knight f3, kingside castles, bishop d3 is Weiss's variation. That's named for Miksa Weiss. He goes by Max, or went by Max. He lived from July 1857 to March 1927. He was also Austrian, and he was a very strong player. In fact, one of his notable results was sharing first place at the 6th American Chess Congress with none other than Mikhail Chigorin, the two-time world champion challenger. Now, by the way, I've got some notes out of Chess Life magazine in which he says, quote, "This line is much better than bishop e2, which I played against Korchnoi at Curacao, 1962. Jerry has something to say about this move. Jerry was recommending, I believe, bishop c4 in his video, if I remember correctly. Or maybe not recommending, but he had a comment as to the difference between these two moves. Anyway, this is Weiss's variation, W-E-I-S-S. Bishop g4. Now, this is not in Weiss's variation. There are actually two lines of the Weiss variation, one of which is knight c6, is answered by e5, which answers this question. D takes e5, f takes e5, knight h5, bishop e3, and bishop g4. The other line is, instead of knight c6, is knight to a6, where we castle kingside, c5 is played, vacating this square. And after d5, then bishop g4 again, and the knight will return here at some point, or maybe here. Now, Bobby Fischer, in his notes, rejected both of those lines, saying the queen's knight to d7 would be better. And the line that he gives here is kingside castles, e5, d takes e5, d takes e5, pawn takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, queen to d4 check, king h1, queen takes knight, and bishop f4, queen c5, and he calls this, quote, a playable game for black. It might interest you to know that Bobby Fischer's advice, this very line that I just showed, has been played 11 times since Bobby wrote about it in Chess Life magazine. Out of those 11 times that black has played this line, black has won 5, lost 3, and drawn 3. Very interesting. Benko rejected all of those lines and played bishop g4. Pawn to h3, bishop takes knight, queen takes bishop, knight c6, bishop e3 defending, e5, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and not pawn takes pawn, but f5. Now here Bobby says, quote, already white has a winning game. Black with his passive position can hardly defend himself against the pawn storm on the king's side. Jerry also said a similar thing in his video. All right, g takes, and Bobby says that was his best try. Knight d4, though, is the move that has been played 41 times since the time this game was played. But Bobby rejected that move. He said g takes is the best try, And he gives the following continuation in refutation of this move. Queen f2, g takes f5, e takes f5. Quote, and white will castle on the queen's side and follow up with pawn to g4 and pawn to g5 with a quick crush in sight, end quote. This advice has been followed 8 times since the writing of that article. 8 times this line that Bobby outlined has been played, and white has won 6 out of 8 with 1 loss and 1 draw. Seems like most of the people that follow Bobby's advice win. I don't know. Let's get back. So Bobby said this was the best choice. And after he takes the pawn, yeah, white's better. He says here, quote, I would have loved to have played pawn takes pawn, but after e4, sound or unsound, black gets more play in the position than he deserves. So queen takes pawn. Knight to d4, and Bobby says white's position, white's queen, quote, let me give you the quote. Quote, white's queen is too strongly placed, so black is willing to give up a pawn, drive it away. Queen f2. Now, when I was studying the game, I wrote down this note. I wrote playable, but surely not as strong as queen takes e5, knight to g4, queen takes bishop, king takes queen, pawn takes knight, and I've got a few other moves that I wrote, but it was this very line that Bobby Fischer made in his article. So I was really happy with myself that up to this point, Bobby Fischer made these comments. He said, quote, if there had been 2 brilliancy prizes awarded in this tournament, I would have accepted the challenge. And played queen takes king's pawn. Then after knight to knight 5, which is the way they talked back then, queen takes bishop check, king takes queen, pawn takes knight. And he says, white's position is overwhelming, end quote. Now, in my studies, I could not find an overwhelming continuation. I thought it was an interesting line, but I took it a little bit farther than this. We don't want to allow this. So black would have to play h5. And after we capture this pawn, he just retreats his knight. We can queenside castle. He can reposition his knight. He can discover an attack, or we can discover an attack. I forget who we're speaking for, but this looks fairly equal to me. The only other choice here is rook takes pawn, saying, no, I am going to get this in, but no, black can play rook h8. And that also looks equal. So I wish Bobby would have given more moves, because I could not find an overwhelming continuation for white. I don't know how the engine rates the position. I'd have to put it into the engine to find out. Queen f2, though, was what he played. Knight e8. And Bobby says, quote, I overlooked this fine move. Now with knight d6, he said knight queen 3, but I translated. He says, now with knight d6 pending, black threatens either to break with pawn to f5, or in some lines, to advance pawn to c5 and c4. He says, quote, I had only considered knight d7, queenside castle, knight c5, king b1, followed by knight e2 and pawn to c3, driving out the pesky knight with an easy win, end quote. We didn't anticipate knight e8. He says here, quote, it was hard to decide on which side to castle. After some thought, I came to the conclusion that it really didn't matter very much. So, queen side, king side, Bobby says, flip a coin. The king side castles, knight d6, sharp, says Bobby. He says, I'd been expecting pawn to c6, and after knight e2, black must either exchange his only well-placed piece or allow white's knight to pass to g3 and then possibly to f5 or h5. He says in this line, of course, c3 would always be available to drive away the knight. End quote. knight d6, queen g3. I thought that a viable alternative is to get your last rook into the game, but Bobby said, quote, originally I intended knight d5, but after f5 and bishop takes knight, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, f takes e4. He says white merely loses a pawn for nothing. And he says, again, if knight to e2, f5 gives black a good game. So he ended up choosing queen to g3, king h8. Forced, says Bobby. If f5 here, says Bobby, bishop h6, end quote. Though, to be honest, this might be more convincing than bishop h6. Says me, not Bobby. That was my note. All right, he says that's forced. Queen g4. White attacking. Jerry thought the purpose was to come here. Bobby says the purpose was to prevent f4. f5, I should say. Bobby says this is too passive. He says black misses his chance for active counterplay, which he could have had with c5. That's c6. Queen h5. And now black definitely has to beware of bishop takes knight. As Bobby himself said, quote, obviously threatening bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and pawn to king 5, which discovers a checkmate threat on h7. And black ignored this threat because Benko had an idea in mind, but that idea has a refutation. Simply moving the knight to e6 or adding the defender to the knight, c5, would have been advisable. Both moves were also recommended by Bobby in the article, so that made me feel good again. So queen e8, bishop takes the knight, pawn takes. Benko calculated this, but Benko did not calculate the next move. The idea of this queen d8 move was that if e5 would be played here, still not showing what Bobby actually played, but Bobby's explaining the idea of queen d8 is that if white were to play e5 here, that can now be answered by f5, blocking the threat against the checkmate while accosting white's queen. So Bobby came with an ingenious way to prevent the pawn from moving to f5. That's right, T-Bow to Baker. Rook to f6. Give that a double exclam, ladles and jolly spoons. And now e5 will kill. White is clearly winning now. Bobby says, quote, with this last move, white blocks the advance of the king's bishop pawn, F-man as we would call it, and renders black completely helpless. Bobby says if pawn takes knight, white mates in 4. Let's look at that line just so you can see it. Pawn takes knight, pawn to e5, threatening mate. That forces this pawn to come to h6, but then you sacrifice the rook again. Same rook sacrificed twice. First sack declined, second sack can also be declined, so then you sack it for a third time. Who sacrifices the same rook 3 times in one game? Only legal move, and there's your checkmate. Wow, what a genius move. Let's just look at all those moves again. I'm going to sacrifice the rook, and he declines the sacrifice. Instead, he takes the knight. So I'll threaten the mate. He has to block. So I'll offer the sacrifice again. Of course, if he takes it, check and mate. But if he declines, I sacrifice it the third time, which he must take this time. Oh, this is beautiful. It's just so beautiful. By the way, if he accepts the sacrifice, it's basically the same thing. It's just different. Oops. If he plays bishop takes, then we still play e5. And there's nothing stopping the capture. All he can do is throw away pieces to stall, like either knight here or here. Oops. to block the bishop, but whether he moves there or there, the bishop still takes. And then h6, and the queen takes, and then king over, and then checkmate. So Benko tried king g8. e5 is played anyway because it's still threatening the checkmate threat. h6 is played, and Bobby says that black is hoping for rook takes d6 here. Because if rook takes d6, queen takes pawn, and black, says Bobby, believe it or not, gets out, end quote. So instead he played knight e2, and Benko resigned. Bobby's saying that black must lose at least a piece. He says if bishop takes rook, well, queen takes pawn is going to be mate. And he says if the knight moves away, queen f5 leads to mate. Let's put it into the computer and see Stockfish's finale. Stockfish versus Stockfish, instant move mode. There we go. Off to the races. Quite a few moves. Benko resigned on move 21. That was move 60. Move 65. Checkmate on move 67.